We've now been introduced to the Act. We've heard how it was developed, what it means to change it. We've heard quite a lot of deep conceptual things that are in the Act. What this session and the next session are going to be covering is how do we actually operationalize some of these deep concepts. And the speakers that are going to be in my session, which is going to take us till the end of the day, we got four speakers, and the general thrust of the session is on this word flexibility in some sense. We've achieved a large number of goals through the 2007 or 2006, depending when you count it, reauthorization, and now as we continue and move forward in the use of the MSA, how we interpret, how we modify, how we utilize the tools that are already in the Act, and perhaps changes to the Act to better achieve its goals. So the first speaker, do we have the first? Oh, where is Rick? I think we need Rick. Okay. So the first speaker in this afternoon session is Dr. Rick Methot from NOAA. I can't give a full introduction to Rick, otherwise he would say his name and say thanks. But Rick is the NOAA's Science Advisor for Stock Assessment, so he is Mr. Stock Assessment in the United States. He's also the author of the most used method of stock assessment, not just in Washington State, Alaska, but in fact, as far as I can work out, the entire planet at this point in time. He's also been very involved in writing some of the National Standard 1 guidelines, and in some sense that is going to be the starting point, I suspect, for his presentation today. Are you all hooked up and tied down?
I'm hooked up. Am I turned on? I appear to be turned on. I'm really turned on by this conference. This has been great so far. And I'm really pleased to have an opportunity to speak here and follow up on what we heard from the history this morning. I have a fairly long history sitting at the interface between fishery science and fishery management. So like this morning's speakers, I ought to start with a little bit of a story where I came from. I started with anchovy in Southern California over 30 years ago, the first fishery management plan, anchovy fishery management plan. We were there, we were working out their commercial recreational balance. It was a forage fish. We were reserving some of it as forage because of the recreational interest. They wanted their sport fish to be able to eat anchovy. All the issues that are on the table today, we were doing it over 30 years ago. So the flexibility is there in the Act, where there's a will to do it, we can pull it off. But I've also lived through some challenges. During the 90s, I was chairman of the groundfish management team for the Pacific Fishery Management Council. And they're living through a decline. We were trying to achieve a soft landing. We knew that we were fishing down the stocks. We were fishing them hard enough to be able to allow some reduction in biomass, and we were shooting for that soft landing to get things just at the right spot. But we didn't quite have the science we needed. We were always not able to update the assessments every year, so we were ratcheting down rather than coming down as it needed to come down. So we were always a little behind the curve. And then in '96, the Sustainable Fisheries Act says we must rebuild, and at the same time we found that there's not as much production coming into the system as we had assumed. You know, the system had been following the best science, but we weren't building in any sort of precautionary buffer, and we found out too late that we now needed to rebuild. We didn't have enough production to do it with, and the stocks had already declined. And so that's part of the message, and part of what now in 2006 we have, you know, it's annual catch limits such that overfishing doesn't occur. And through the national standard guidelines, we've implemented that in a way to recognize that there's going to always be some uncertainty in the system. We need to acknowledge that, and so we can work on preventing situations such as occur there and occasionally has played out elsewhere. So let me proceed then into it. I've got a door open in front of me here that's going to be a little challenging unless I deal with that. Make sure I got everything working as I need to. Very good. So what I'm going to talk about is sort of that scientific basis for sustainable fisheries. How is it that we say that we can provide the support that's needed in order to get to the successful management that we want? But I certainly am going to proceed from there into some areas of it that, I think there is opportunity, even within our current set of legislation and guidelines, to implement some greater flexibility. And certainly I'm going to address at the end the issues around how good is good enough? How much science do we need in order to support the management of the fisheries? And what can we achieve that allows us to provide guidance where we need it and really high precision where we can take advantage of it? So, the Act is all about balancing conservation and utilization to provide food production, to provide recreational fishing opportunities, while at the same time preventing overfishing of those same fish stocks, protecting the ecosystem in which they live. And we can do this when we have good science to draw this line between the right balance between preventing overfishing and achieving optimum yield. But where things get fuzzy, where we don't know things well enough, we need to err a bit on the side of uncertainty in order to preserve that future opportunity to know better and then to obtain that extra yield that might be available from the system. So it's about this balance, but it's a science-based balance so that we can try to understand the system and guide the management from there. So, what's the scientific basis for doing this? I'm going to start with an example a little bit closer to home. So over on the right-hand side there, you see a rover out in the field of tall grass. They're not mowing it. It's fallow field. No grass clippings, pretty happy ecosystem for rover there. And over on the left-hand side, here's a putting green. We're out there probably twice a day mowing the darn thing, trying to keep it as smooth and flat as possible for one little purpose of keeping it for the putting green, not producing any clippings, or we're putting a whole lot of effort into it for not much gain in terms of clippings. And there's my lawn there in the middle, at least what I hope for. And mowing it once a week, sort of maximum production of grass clippings. It's a managed ecosystem for me. It's there, it's something we use, play croquet, picnic, but it's a managed system. All natural systems work sort of like this. There's some degree of sustainable production at some moderate degree of impact. We're able to extract extra benefits from what had been a natural system, but now we're part of that system and we're looking to obtain benefits from it in a balanced, sustainable way. The same thing is going on with fish and fishing. Over on the right-hand side, no fish are being caught each year. It's a natural system. More fish are living to old age, large fish. Over on the left-hand side, there's way too high a fraction of the fish being caught each year. They're dying off quickly. It's not a very big stock. You're fishing really hard. Nothing big left to be caught. In the middle, we have a situation where we've got an intermediate level. It's something that, in principle, over time, over long-term averaging, could produce some maximum sustainable yield. That's the kind of concept that we're after here with fish and fishing. Now, that's an ideal. The real curve isn't anything as smooth as that nice blue line there. It's responding to ecosystem factors, climate factors. It's shifting. There's fluctuations from year to year. It's a cartoon of what's the reality, but we can't know the reality anywhere nearly as precisely as I can draw it on this diagram. So by not aiming to try to get that theoretical maximum right there at the middle, instead to aim a little bit to the right, where with a little bit lower effort, we can achieve higher catch rates, less fluctuations, larger fish, less ecosystem impact, a buffer against uncertainty. There's a lot of pluses once you can get there. But how quickly you can get there and can you get there from here are certainly the immediate challenges that get faced in all of our regulatory systems. Nevertheless, that can be the goal. So let me recast this. I've redrawn the x-axis here. So before it was no fishing over here. Well, no fishing means biggest biomass, and too much fishing means not very much biomass. And I think the rest of the figures are going to be in this orientation. So here, the issue is that if we're up in this corner, we're catching more than the production, so we're moving the biomass down, but we still are able to catch this amount for a while, but we're moving in this direction. We're sort of aiming for this spot, but if we keep the catch at that same level, we're just going to overshoot it, and we're going to end up down here. And before long, you're going to be down in this quadrant where you're overfishing and back to a place where we cannot sustain it. Maximum sustainable yield is not something that you can exceed because it's the maximum over time. It's the biological limit. You can't get more than this in the long term. In the short term, you can, but in the long term, it's not possible. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the maximum. Now, if you get below this curve, now you have the catch less reduction. It's going to allow it to grow. In principle, you could stabilize anywhere along this curve, but there's always going to be natural fluctuations that's going to be moving around. And if you're over on this side and you're trying to keep it somewhere down on the balance point here, it's really risky because you don't know exactly where you're at all that well. You're trying, but you don't know it perfectly. And the natural fluctuations, you're just not going to be able to keep up with it. So it's a very risky place to be. So the next question is, I presented the previous diagrams with no real scale on the bottom. I put it in terms of no fishing and way too much because it depends upon the biology of the animals on how much is way too much. For some short-spined thorny head that lives 150 years, way too much might be 5% a year being caught. Whereas for shrimp, it might be 200% a year. And the range is huge. And the diversity of life history of animals is huge. And that's part of what we work on calibrating when we do this stock assessment thing. It depends upon natural mortality rates and other biology. When we think about, what fraction are we harvesting and are we overfishing? Well, turn it around. Look at some of the rockfish. Like over 95% escape the fishery every year. There's a big buffer. It only plays out over time, the effects of overfishing. In the short term, there's very little consequence of catching 4% versus 3% in a given year because it's 96 or 97% survival. But it does compound over time, and if you do end up in too low of a spot for an animal like that, then it equally takes a very long time to rebuild. So it's happening slower. Turnover rates are slower. You have a bit more time, but we haven't found a way to scale our regulatory process and our attention to it. We're pretty much locked into this annual thing, whether we're dealing with 150-year-old short-spined thorny heads, an ocean quahog, or 2-year-old anchovy. So let me take a little bit of an aside right here. Andre asked me to have a recreational slide and a salmon slide, and you're going to see them both. And so here's the recreational slide, because it is important. I've talked pretty much in terms of what are optimal harvest weights, what's sustainable, but it's a little bit in the eyes of the beholder and what you really want to achieve. We've already heard the recreational story, some of the cutbacks in the length of the season for red snapper. It's that fishing opportunity that's so important. It's that having the season that's open that is very important. And rather than maximizing the total number of red snapper that the recreational fishery catches, it's the opportunity to fish that's provided by those fish that's important for them. And so there's somewhat of a different nuance in the values of commercial versus recreational fisheries. And if you bring a third player, basically the ecosystem needs to the table, that also brings a different consideration. And we don't really do enough to look at these differences as we try to design what are optimal harvest policies for the fisheries. They're pretty much built around the maximizing production paradigm. And I think that's one of the areas where bringing more ecosystem science to the table and more economics to the table is going to help us design better control rules in order to guide the fisheries for the future. So I just mentioned control rules. So let me get to that a little bit. Now before, I had the big arrow up here, and it was showing that if you're catching up here, you're going to push it down. If you're catching up here, you're going to push it way down. But if you're down here, you can allow some growth. So how do you operationalize that on a year-to-year basis? These lines are the way to do that. These are very simple control rules. It's just one nice straight line that says that if you're catching more than this line, you're overfishing. If you're right on the line, you're right on the limit, and below the line, you have some buffer against that limit. So if this red line, which intersects right at the MSY point, is the theoretical limit and fishing beyond this is going to be overfishing, then by setting a buffer between the red line and the green line gives us some degree of protection against the consequences, the long-term consequences to the system of overfishing. Now, the way our stock assessments work, they both calibrate the overall blue production curve, they forecast what the biomass would be next year, read up on it, here's the overfishing limit, here's an acceptable biological catch that could be the operational basis for the fishery in the coming year. Of course, there's uncertainty in the system, and we can operationalize things in this way, but the implementation is always going to have some degree of time lags between when you collect data and when you produce a forecast, some degree of uncertainty in the data, and the system itself is always throwing you curveballs. So it's a monitoring, it's a long-term monitoring, it's something that we need to maintain. We can't just set a limit and let it go. It needs to be something that is dynamic and responsive to a changing system. So recap a little bit of the things that we embedded in the National Standard Guidelines 5 years ago. The concept of an overfishing limit, that's basically our risk neutral. We don't build uncertainty into this. This is our best estimate that's created with some degree of uncertainty to it. And because of that uncertainty, we see the need to set an acceptable biological catch that has some buffer against that overfishing. The annual catch limit is then basically the science management handoff. We're going from what's the best that the science can produce in terms of the forecast status of that stock, and then how can the managers work to manage the fishery in order to not exceed that limit. So the ABC to the ACL is that science management handoff, and then optionally, some degree of additional consideration where there's insufficient in-season controls in order to actually manage the catch right up to that annual catch limit. Situations like the North Pacific, with an extensive observer program, we can manage almost to the last fish the in-season catch. No need for an additional buffer there for that consideration. Other situations, recreational fisheries, where there's much greater time lag in getting data, much more imprecision in the data, it's harder to do, and you need a bit more of a buffer against that management uncertainty. I think we saw this slide this morning in Sam's introductory talk on how well are we doing. And I agree, we're doing very well. And we still have some stocks that are overfishing. I'm going to proceed next into some of the ways in which this overfishing can continue to occur. We report 28. Some of them are international, where it's much more challenging in order to be certain that we have all sources of mortality under good control so that we can eliminate that overfishing. In other cases, there's situations where these are old determinations. We've not yet been able to verify that the new management measures in place have been able to stop that overfishing. Nevertheless, we do still report that there are 28 cases. So, how does overfishing occur? Well, one of them, the one that we've stopped, is that by having ACLs that now have to build in, to be below that overfishing limit, that is a pre-fishing action, pre-fishing season action that prevents the intentional overfishing. The other is this management uncertainty, where you've set a good, plausible, well-intentioned limit, but you don't have in place the controls in season to be certain that the catch stays under that limit. So that's where management uncertainty plays in, and it happens within a fishing year. But then it gets a little fuzzier after that, because now we get into this era of scientific uncertainty where you're making your best estimate that you can this year. You know it's not perfect, and so when you look back in hindsight, some of that imperfection is going to be further illuminated as you have that hindsight, and we can find sometimes that the catch limit was set too high, and now we realize that it should have been lower, but oops, we caught as much as we said we were going to catch, but we now find out that some overfishing was still occurring. So now we're looking at a few years hindsight to say, where is the lag in the science information and how does this play out? We'll call that the scientific uncertainty. We're trying to anticipate how big a buffer we need to anticipate that some of this happens, but that'll be imperfect itself in how well we can do it. But on a longer term time scale, there's something I'll call ecosystem uncertainty. And that's basically is the way in which you're doing all this, really capturing all the important factors. Let me divert to a story. Go to forest management. suppression of forest fires for decades and decades, very successful on suppressing forest fires, realizing that the beetles were then a worse problem coming into some of the forests. So that would be an example of the kind of, oops, we didn't have the whole ecosystem picture right in order to impose our management approach. We need to be watchful for this kind of thing in fisheries too, but it's going to play out on a much longer time scale as things happen slowly and the system adapts. So salmon. I'm the home of salmon here. I never worked a lot on salmon myself, I must say. I'm a sablefish guy. I cut my teeth in groundfish working on the deep water complex, sablefish, thorny heads, and Dover sole. The big ocean fisheries, the whitefish fisheries, you end up with a few, oftentimes rather widespread stocks. Many of them are quite long-lived, with many ages in the fishery and many ages in the spawning biomass. And so those things you have some turnover rate that's moderate. And over here on the salmon side, well, now we're dealing with many river-specific stocks, which adds a whole new dimension of complexity. And they get mixed together in some of the ocean fisheries, which has a different degree of complexity. How do we separate them when they're out in the ocean fisheries? Fortunately, we have technologies now to do this, genetics and tags and the like, but there are differences here. They tend to be short-lived, and it's focused on what's happening with that one single generation of animals as they pass through. They spawn once and die. One of the, I think, unfortunate terminology differences that's evolved in these two communities that work on these two different animals is over here we tend to talk in terms of depletion, or basically how much have we reduced, how much we depleted the stock below what it would have been if we weren't fishing. That's the kind of terminology that's built up over here. And over here in the salmon side, forever we've been talking about escapement of fish into the rivers to spawn. When you step back and you do the math, it's really the same concept here, and I think we may have missed some opportunity for clarity by letting this persist as long as it has, perhaps. Even though I probably was partly party to creating the depletion term. Let me switch back to the degree of overfishing that has been occurring, and focus now on the technical status of 130 stocks that we know the most about, basically the ones that we have pretty good numbers for. And here I've put this axis in terms of how hard are we fishing relative to the limit, and how abundant is the stock relative to its target, right? And so each point on here is a stock. The overfishing is up top here. The overfished is down here, and stuff down in this region that's low fishing but still below the target. These are sort of the rebuilding stocks down here. And we have a whole scatter in this plot of where are we at. I mean, if a stock was basically at MSY, it would be near the one here and near the one here. So that's sort of the MSY area. But, and we have a lot of stocks in what I call this pretty good yield era, where we're fishing them not that intensely and their biomass is above average. And so we're getting pretty good yield out of them by a lower fishing rate on a higher biomass. That's good. You're here in this green spot, not in this red spot. But they are spread widely. And so I'll get back to this plot later on, and I'll look at it in particular in this dimension of how many stocks are at different fishing intensity levels when I talk about how much information do we need to manage each fish stock. Let me get back to overfishing. Again, it's a one-dimension thing. Did we catch too many fish last year? And one way of looking at this is a little bit of overfishing is going to, in this case, even potentially allow for a little bit of biomass growth, whereas a lot of overfishing is going to pretty certainly drive the stock biomass down. A little bit of overfishing here on a stock that's already pretty low, while in principle it might keep it unchanged, you're still down in the risky zone, even though you potentially still have a little bit of surplus production. But up here, yeah, you're overfishing a little bit and you're going to be pushing the stock down, but it's still in a pretty healthy state. Up here, it's not a gross excess in catch each year, but it's persistent year after year, a little bit above the line. Not a situation where you're bouncing around, and occasionally, the management control did not keep the catch below the line, but on average, you're doing pretty well. These different dimensions of degree of overfishing mean that, with just focusing on is overfishing, catching too many fish in a year, is not putting enough attention on, well, what's the consequences for the fish stock? Where is it going to be moving the fish stock in the future? Can we take a longer term view on the impact of degree of fishing, whether it's overfishing or not? So the idea of moving towards a longer term view on how to do things, gets into one idea of trying to recognize better the interaction between the pace at which new science comes to the table and the pace at which management can and should respond to that science. Today we have, the simple control rule, put in the biomass and go up to the line and out comes the ABC. Pretty simple control rule. So we go out and measure a new biomass and we come up with the ABC. But that biomass is measured with some degree of imprecision, to some error to it. In fact, the true biomass might have been this that year, but we thought it was this. We're within the error bars, but we're never going to get it perfect on average. So why are we making, every time we get a new piece of science, jumping to the new point estimate? There are other systems in place already. The European Union has sort of a 15% degree of change in TAC from one year to the next. Locally, the Halibut Commission has some degree of throttle on the degree of change that they'll allow the management to change in response to the new science that comes on board. It is possible to redesign the control rule to make it just a little bit more complex. It builds in some inertia. It says, well, where were we at last year? What was our limit last year? And then as we get new science that seems to say to go here, if we build in a control rule that says, oh, let's phase it in, and then next year it said to go up here, but we'll phase that one in too, and design some, in this case, a 70-30 phase-in rule so that you're always moving in the direction of the best science information available, but you're not snapping to each new point estimate. You're using it, but you're not overreacting to it. It's a way to achieve a bit of a balance between providing some stability over time in the recommendations on how to manage the fishery while still making it responsive to the science and still preventing any consequences of overfishing. You're still preventing overfishing, you're just doing it through what I believe would be a more realistic kind of control rule. Because you contrast that to situations where we're not able to do assessments every year, and we end up going sometimes in the Gulf of Mexico, where it might be 6-8 years between assessments. The quota tends to stay constant in between. So if we're willing to live with and recognize that that's the status quo when we don't have annual assessments, why, when we have annual assessments, do we force ourselves to snap to the new point estimate? I think there's a better way to do it that just needs some analysis. It just needs a good demonstration of the degree to which this meets the goals of preventing overfishing and achieving optimal yield. So when I presented a couple of slides ago this issue of the range of fishing mortality rates that fish stocks sustain, it really gets to the issue of which stocks need management and how much. Across the country, part of the regional diversity has been how the fishery management plans have been constructed. We have very inclusive fishery management plans in the Pacific generally, and very species-specific fishery management plans in the Atlantic. And by having a very inclusive fishery management plan, you end up with things that, well, you're not really trying to catch MSY out of all those stocks that are listed there. They're there because you want to pay attention to them. You recognize that they're part of the system, but they're not part of what you're striving to get as optimum yield. So in this situation here, where we know that the catching has been really high, we really probably overstressed the system, here's where the alarm bells are going off, and we really need to pay close attention to it. Over here, it's a pretty relaxed case. If it's basically an ecosystem component, yeah, we need to pay attention to everything that's out there, but we don't need to do annual assessments on situations like that. And here in the middle, we're trying to have a very managed system. We're trying to get as much out of it as we can. We need to pay close attention to it. But I think the hardest point is stocks that are sort of in this zone right here, where we now have enough information to say that, well, we're not fishing them as hard as you might, but we're doing pretty good. We're getting some good yield out of them. We're not fishing them too hard. They're abundant. But how much attention do we need to pay in an operational sense, and how can we get the right balance? So the overall issue is which stocks really need management. The Act says that we develop fishery management plans for fisheries that are in need of conservation and management. But the decision on which stocks to include and then the subsequent implications is what we need to think about a little bit further, I think. Because once things are in the plan, they essentially are saying they need some management. So we're basically starting off saying that, well, maybe this stock is more than incidentally impacted by fishing. And once we make that decision, once we say it's a managed stock, well, then we need status determination criteria and we need annual catch limits. But how can we develop these things if it's based upon really weak information? We've worked to develop some data-limited methods to do it, but they're far from a complete assessment. And so, how complete and timely an assessment do we need in order to provide the stuff to implement these things, which are based upon the fact that we've included a stock in the fishery management plan? So let me go a little bit into this whole data poor, data limited approach to providing information to manage fisheries. Since the re-authorization in 2006 and the National Standard Guidelines in 2009, we've put a good bit more effort into trying to develop, as far as we can, data-limited, data-poor assessment methods. And this is what we needed to do in order to provide some annual catch limit advice for those stocks. But you really need to have some additional information. Knowing catch is not enough other than to know that there were some fish out there and some fish were caught. If you've been getting about the same amount over time, you probably could feel somewhat confident that it's sustainable, but you don't really know if you're slowly grinding the stock down or if it's just barely touching the tip of the iceberg of what's the potential for that fish stock. You need to know something else. You need to know something about, is there a trend in the abundance of the fish stock? And there's ways to get information about that. Or you need to be able to make a comparison between what you see for that fished stock versus something that is, is more lightly fished or unfished. Or there's a smaller mean size, or is it higher densities in a closed area versus an open area? You need another piece of information in order to say, are we somewhere closer to this point, or somewhere in the middle? That's the first, is that triage of the data limited stocks that needs to start the ball rolling. So, we have in our system today the division of stocks into managed stocks and what we call ecosystem component stocks, but that bar is very low. In order to be an ecosystem component, there really can be just trivial degrees of fishing and no retention. The question today is really, is it feasible for us to try to draw the line at a different place? Is there a way to create a category of target stocks and non-target stocks to better, but the problem is going to be that, what I've portrayed here is that there's sort of a continuous distribution from right at the overfishing line down to no fishing, and there's stocks spread all along here. There's no natural break in this distribution to say that down here it's one thing and up here it's clearly a target. Because there's a whole lot of complex reasons why a stock might be experiencing only a low fishing rate. And it could be lack of market, it could be there because of bycatch of a less productive stock, we can't allow targeting of that stock. It could be on a rebuilding plan. There's diverse reasons why you're down here. And so trying to come up with some protocols for us to say that some stocks are target stocks, they need the intense management and science to support it, and other stocks are not targets and they need less intense or can get away with less intense, is not going to be easy, but nevertheless, there does seem to be some merits as we try to figure out how do we prioritize the resources we have to focus them in the right way, get the right balance between target and non-target. And so that gets into, one other short concept here, and something that Steve Cadron, next speaker, will follow up on to a much greater degree. But the idea that we'll take some of our data-limited stocks and aggregate them into a stock complex. And basically, we'll treat it as if they were cookie cutters of each other, that we can take an indicator stock and look at it more closely and manage according to what we see happening to that stock, and basically apply the conclusions to everything that is part of that complex. Versus a mixed stock fishery, which also is fish that live together and also is fish that are caught together to probably a somewhat lesser degree than what we assume for a complex. But here, we know more about each of them. We have some individual information. We can see the differences. We can see that one can sustain a rate of 0.15 a year, the other only 0.1. And once we see these differences, we tend to naturally go towards employing sort of a weak stock management approach to it. So, in moving forward, as we think about target, non-target, complexes, mixed stocks, these are all interrelated concepts that I think need to be looked at pretty holistically. And as we think about management of complexes, I don't think it's been the right thing to, once we assess another stock in a complex, to pull it out and manage it separately and then just leave all the unknowns in the complex. It's better to keep more of them in there and use them as a collection of indicators about the complex and look at it a little bit more holistically. And on the mixed stock side, certainly we need to strive to achieve, some technical management of the fishery in order to get just the right catch level for each stock and reduce to the extent we can the incidental catch of other species. But it's natural for species to be caught together. Again, I grew up with sablefish, Dover sole, thorny heads, and it's ingrained in my thinking on the fisheries. But one of the tools that I think we need is this idea that when we talk about optimum yield, we should look at it much more holistically than we do historically. That, when you think about what's happening in a region, well, it's a regional ecosystem of the animals interacting with each other, and there's a whole bunch of different kinds of fisheries going on. There's recreational, there's commercial of various sorts. We have participants who might fish crab in the winter and groundfish in the spring and shrimp in the summer. The way in which they get their optimum employment for the year is a whole mix of fisheries that might not be in the same fishery management plans. So when we talk about bringing economics to the table in evaluating what is the optimum yield from a fishery, I think we need to step back and look at it much more holistically than setting optimum yield for a species. And we have in place today the whole annual catch limit system that gives us a tool for annual targets and limits for each species. That's a tool. And so I think that it's better for us to think, now again, more holistically about the optimum yield concept if we're going to try to use it as a way to rationalize some balance of the level of fishing that occurs across species that occur together. Close to wrap up. One of the holistic ideas is, Galen Trouble and I have used this a couple of times now, the 75% solution. And basically the idea that, by building in this kind of buffer in the system, we over time, as we transition to a point like this, we can get like 93% of MSY at 75% of the limit harvest rate. It's sort of a sweet spot to get to. You're not falling too far down onto underfishing curve here. You're getting pretty close to the maximum, and a whole host of potential benefits that could come from it. And stocks will pretty much naturally rebuild when you get to that. As we put in place the National Standard Guidelines in 2009, we recognize that if you get to the end of the rebuilding plan and you're not rebuilt, the sky doesn't fall at that point in time. The fishery doesn't have to stop because it hasn't been completely rebuilt at that point in time. But we did put in place that, at minimum, you need to continue that rebuilding rate or this lower 75% rate until you get rebuilt. These kind of things, can, in the long run, give us a good, sustainable fisheries. So in summary, I presented the basic scientific guidance that underpins our fishery management system and a few ideas where we might be able to improve it. Despite best intentions, some types of overfishing will continue to occur. One of the areas where we can potentially develop a little bit more flexibility is in this phase-in rule, which we can test with this tool called management strategy evaluations to make it very transparent. What do we expect to get out of such a system? If we're going to proceed with prioritizing how we spend our dollar on across fish stocks, I think we need to look closely at targets, non-targets, and how do we allocate our effort in order to get as much information where we need it and enough information across the board. We need to have baselines on everything, but we need to have more precision in some cases. I've not directly addressed ecosystem and environmental factors. I've drawn some very simple curves, but keeping fisheries sustainable means that we need to be prepared to be reacting to the longer term shifts, and our technical management in the short term needs to do better at adjusting to these short term effects. Thank you very much.